The war had lasted 11 years. 11 years of burning ships and silent funerals. 11 years of broken planets and orphaned children. 11 years of two civilizations tearing each other apart across the stars, and neither one willing to be the first to stop. On one side stood the Valorian Queendom, an empire so old that its history books filled entire space stations. The Valorians were tall and silver-skinned, with eyes like liquid gold. They moved through the galaxy like royalty, because that is exactly what they believed they were. Their technology was ancient and powerful. Their fleets darkened the skies of 100 worlds. They had conquered dozens of species before, and they had expected humanity to be no different. They were wrong. On the other side stood the Terran Confederation, humanity's answer to the stars. Compared to the Valorians, humans were young, small, fragile. Their ships were ugly and loud. Their soldiers were soft-bodied and short-lived. On paper, the war should have been over in weeks. But humans did not read that paper. They fought like nothing the Valorians had ever seen. When their ships were destroyed, they built more. When their colonies burned, they dug into the ashes and fired back. When their generals fell, privates picked up the sword and kept swinging. 11 years later, the mighty Valorian Queendom had not conquered humanity. Instead, it was bleeding. And now, aboard the neutral diplomatic station known as Atheron's Cradle, something extraordinary was about to happen. Queen Selara Vasthian sat upon her throne in the grand hall of the station. She was over 300 years old, though she did not look it. Her silver skin glowed under the soft lights, and her golden eyes watched everything with the sharpness of a blade. She wore armor made of woven starlight, a tradition for Valorian queens in times of negotiation. It meant she came not as a friend, but as a ruler willing to listen. Around her stood her court, generals in ceremonial plate, diplomats in flowing robes, psychic advisors with their eyes half closed, reading the emotional currents of the room. All of them were tense. All of them were tired. The war was killing them, and everyone in this room knew it. Selara had read the reports. The outer colonies were rioting. The shipyards could not keep up with losses. Trade routes had collapsed. Food shortages were spreading. Her empire, which had stood for thousands of years, was cracking at the edges, all because of a species that had only discovered space travel 2 centuries ago. It was humiliating, and it was unsustainable. The Terran delegation arrived through the main doors. There were 5 of them, 3 diplomats in dark suits, 1 translator who was clearly nervous, and 1 older woman with gray hair and steady eyes. She was Ambassador Lena Marsh, the head of the Terran peace delegation. There were no admirals, no generals, no soldiers at all. Selara found this interesting. Ambassador Marsh bowed not deeply but respectfully. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the grand hall. Your Majesty, thank you for agreeing to this summit. The Terran Confederation comes with a sincere desire for peace. Selara tilted her head. You desire peace because you are losing. With respect, Your Majesty, Marsh replied. If either side were truly winning, we would not both be here. A murmur rippled through the Valorian court. Selara raised one hand, and the room fell silent. Speak your terms, the Queen said. Ambassador Marsh opened a small data tablet and placed it on the central table. A holographic document floated into the air between them. It was long, detailed, and filled with legal language from a dozen galactic treaties. But the heart of it was simple. We propose a political marriage, Marsh said. A union between the leader of the Valorian Queendom and a representative chosen by the Terran Confederation. Under Section 12 of the Galactic Covenant of Species, such a union would create a binding blood oath between both civilizations. It would make further war legally and culturally impossible. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Selara laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was cold and sharp like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Her court shifted uncomfortably. Several generals clenched their fists. You want me, Selara said slowly, to marry a human. Yes, Your Majesty. A human, a creature that lives barely a century, a species that eats cooked animal flesh and cannot even breathe underwater. You want the queen of the Valorian queendom, ruler of 9-star systems and protector of the eternal throne, to bind herself to one of your kind. Marsh did not blink. That is the proposal, yes. Selara leaned forward, her golden eyes burned. This is an insult. It is a solution, Marsh replied calmly. Your Majesty, neither of us can afford 2 more years of this war. You know it. We know it. The galaxy knows it. This marriage would end the bloodshed immediately. Both sides keep their territory. Both sides keep their pride. And both sides survive. Selara stared at her for a long time. The psychic advisors shifted, sensing the storm of emotions inside their queen: fury, exhaustion, and something else. Something that might have been desperation, buried deep. Finally, Selara spoke. Who? Marsh blinked. Your Majesty. Who do you propose I marry? Which human have you chosen to stand beside me? Marsh folded her hands. His name is Captain Idris Wren. A captain? One of Selara's generals stepped forward, his voice full of disbelief. Not even an admiral, not a senator or a council member. You offer our queen a mere captain. Marsh looked at the general with calm, steady eyes. Captain Wren is the Terran Confederation's choice. We did not make that choice lightly. Selara raised her hand again, silencing her general. She studied the ambassador's face carefully. Humans were easy to read. They wore their emotions on their skin, in the flush of their cheeks and the movement of their eyes. But this woman was controlled, confident. She believed in what she was offering. I will consider it, Selara said, but I have a condition. Name it. I will meet this Captain Wren before any agreement is signed. I will judge him myself. If I find him unworthy, if he is weak, or foolish, or beneath the dignity of my throne, the deal is dead, and the war continues. Marsh nodded slowly. That is acceptable. He can be here within 3 days. Then we are done for today. The Terran delegation bowed and left the hall. The moment the doors closed, the Valorian court erupted. Generals shouted. Diplomats argued. The psychic advisors whispered urgently to each other. The noise filled the grand hall like a storm. Selara ignored all of it. She turned to her spymaster, a thin and shadowy Valorian named Keyleth, who stood silently at her shoulder as he always did. Find me everything there is to know about this Captain Idris Wren, she said quietly. Everything. His service record, his personal history, his blood type, what he eats for breakfast. I want to know this man better than his own mother did. Keyleth bowed and disappeared. 3 hours later, he returned to her private quarters. His face was troubled. Well, Selara asked. The file is mostly empty, my queen. Selara frowned. Empty. Classified, redacted, sealed at the highest levels of Terran military intelligence. I used every contact and every back channel we have. Almost nothing came through. He paused. There is one item. He placed a data chip on her desk. A holographic image flickered to life. It showed a man. He was standing in front of a Valorian dreadnought, one of the largest warships ever built. The dreadnought was on fire. Its hull was cracked open like an egg, and black smoke poured from its wounds into a blood-red sky. The man stood with his back to the destruction. He was not tall, not particularly strong-looking. He wore a torn and dirty Terran uniform, and there was blood on his face. But his eyes were calm, perfectly, impossibly calm. He looked directly into the camera as if he had all the time in the world. Selara stared at the image for a long time. That dreadnought, she said softly. Which one is it? The Valkarath, my queen. It was destroyed at the Battle of the Ember Straits. We lost 8,000 soldiers that day. Selara said nothing. She studied those calm eyes. She had looked into the eyes of warriors, kings, and conquerors. She had seen ambition, hatred, and madness, but she had never seen eyes like these. They were not the eyes of a man who enjoyed war. They were the eyes of a man who had walked through it and come out the other side with something still intact inside him. It unsettled her more than any weapon ever had. She turned to her handmaiden, who stood quietly by the door. "What are they sending me?" she whispered. The handmaiden had no answer. And somewhere across the station, in a small and unremarkable Terran quarters, a message arrived on a battered personal terminal. It was short. "Captain Wren, your presence is requested at Atheron's cradle. The Queen has agreed to meet you. You know what this means. The fate of both our peoples rests on what happens next. Do not let us down." Idris Wren read the message twice. Then he closed the terminal, looked out the window at the endless stars, and let out a long, slow breath. "All right," he said to no one, "let's go meet a queen." The ship that carried Captain Idris Wren to Atheron's cradle was not what anyone expected. The Valorians had prepared for something grand, perhaps a Terran battlecruiser, bristling with weapons and draped in flags, perhaps a diplomatic yacht, sleek and polished, designed to impress. Queen Selara had even ordered her honor guard to line the docking bay in full ceremonial armor, their energy lances glowing softly in the dim light. Instead, what docked at Bay 14 was a Terran corvette, small, battered, and ugly. Its hull was scorched in a dozen places. One of its stabilizer fins was dented. The name painted on its side was faded but still readable, The Long Walk. The honor guard exchanged glances. The Valorian docking officer stared at his screen, convinced there had been a mistake. There had not been a mistake. The corvette's ramp lowered with a mechanical groan, and a single man walked down it. Idris Wren was not what they expected either. He was average height for a human, which meant he was short by Valorian standards. His hair was dark and cut close to his head. His face was weathered, not old, but worn like leather that had been left out in the rain too many times. He wore a simple Terran dress uniform, dark blue with silver buttons. No medals, no ribbons, no decorations of any kind. He carried nothing except a small leather bag over one shoulder. The honor guard stood at attention as he passed. Idris looked at each of them, not with fear, not with arrogance, but with something that resembled quiet curiosity. He nodded once politely and kept walking. The docking officer stepped forward. "Captain Wren, welcome to Atheron's cradle. The Queen awaits you in the grand reception hall aboard her royal cruiser." "Thank you," Idris said. His voice was calm and unhurried. "Lead the way." As they walked through the long corridors of the station, Valorian soldiers and officials stopped to stare. Word had spread quickly. The human who might marry their queen was here. They studied him like scientists studying a strange insect, with fascination and a little disgust. Idris did not seem to notice, or if he did not care. The grand reception hall aboard Selara's royal cruiser was designed to overwhelm. The ceiling rose 50 meters high, covered in living crystal that shifted colors like an aurora. The floor was polished black stone that reflected everything like a dark mirror. Along the walls stood statues of ancient Valorian queens, each one carved from a single piece of moonstone. At the far end of the hall, on a throne made of woven silver light, sat Queen Selara Vasthian. She had dressed for this occasion with purpose. Her armor was the deepest black, trimmed with threads of gold that moved like living things. Her crown was a circle of floating crystal shards that orbited her head slowly, catching the light. She looked like a goddess from an old story, powerful, beautiful, and untouchable. Around her stood the finest her empire had to offer, generals who had conquered worlds, diplomats who had brokered treaties across the galaxy, psychic advisors whose minds could read emotions like open books. And behind them, half hidden in shadow, her spymaster Keyleth watched with narrow eyes. All of this was designed to make one thing clear: you are small and we are vast. Idris walked into the hall and stopped at the proper distance from the throne. He looked up at the queen. For a moment, he simply studied her face, the way someone might study a painting they found beautiful but did not yet understand. Then he bowed. It was not a deep bow. It was not the bow of a servant or a defeated enemy. It was the bow of one leader acknowledging another, measured, respectful, and without a trace of submission. "Your Majesty," he said, "thank you for agreeing to meet me. I know this is not easy for you. It is not easy for me either, but I believe it is worth doing." His words were spoken in perfect High Valorian. The hall went silent, not quiet silent, the kind of silence that falls when something impossible happens. High Valorian was considered one of the most difficult languages in the galaxy. Its grammar changed depending on the speaker's social rank, the time of day, and the emotional context of the conversation. Most non-Valorians could not even pronounce its basic sounds. Translators spent decades mastering it and still made errors. This human spoke it without a single mistake. His accent was slightly rough, like stones tumbling in a river, but his phrasing was flawless. He had even used the correct formal register, the one reserved for addressing a sitting monarch during a first audience. Selara's golden eyes widened slightly. It was the only sign of surprise she allowed herself. "You speak our language," she said. "I do," Idris replied, switching back to common galactic standard. "I hope that is acceptable. I wanted our first words to be in your tongue, not mine." Selara tilted her head. "Where did you learn it?" "During the war. I spent a long time listening to Valorian communications. At first it was for intelligence. Later it became something else. Your language is beautiful, Your Majesty. It deserves to be spoken, not just decoded." A murmur went through the court. Several of the older diplomats looked at each other with expressions that were hard to read. Selara gestured to the long table that had been prepared for the formal dinner. "Sit. We will eat, and we will talk. I wish to understand what kind of man the Terrans have sent me." The dinner was a test. Selara had designed every detail to probe, challenge, and expose. The food was traditional Valorian, dishes that most aliens found strange or unpleasant. Fermented crystal kelp, roasted starbloom seeds, a soup made from the marrow of deep-sea creatures that glowed faintly blue. Most humans would have struggled with the textures and flavors. Idris ate everything, not with fake enthusiasm but with genuine appreciation. When a servant placed a dish of silverroot paste before him, he smiled. "Ah," he said, "this is from the northern provinces, yes, the Keldara region. The paste is ground differently there, coarser, with a slightly bitter finish. It pairs well with the kelp." The servant nearly dropped her tray. The diplomats at the table stared. Even Selara paused, her spoon halfway to her lips. "You know our food," she said. "I know your culture," Idris replied simply. "Or at least I have tried to learn it. 11 years is a long time, Your Majesty. I did not spend all of it fighting." As the dinner continued, Selara watched him carefully. She saw how he handled the ceremonial utensils correctly, without hesitation. She saw how he addressed each member of her court with the appropriate title and rank. He made no errors. He offended no one. It was infuriating. She had expected a brute, a simple soldier she could dismiss and send home. Instead, she found a man who had studied her people more carefully than most Valorians studied themselves. Halfway through the meal, War General Draven leaned forward. Draven was enormous even by Valorian standards, with scars running down both arms and a reputation for cruelty. He had lost 3 major battles to the Terrans and carried that shame like a blade against his skin. "Tell me, Captain," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous. "How does it feel to sit here, eating our food and speaking our words, when your hands are stained with Valorian blood?" The table went quiet. Several diplomats looked away. This was the moment Selara had been waiting for, the crack, the flinch, the reveal of who this man truly was beneath the calm surface. Idris set down his utensils. He looked at Draven with steady eyes. "General Draven," he said, "I recognize your name. You commanded the Valorian forces at Kessara 7. Draven stiffened. "I did." "It was a difficult battle," Idris said. His voice was not boastful. It was quiet, almost tired. The terrain was volcanic. The ash clouds made sensors useless on both sides. Your forces outnumbered mine more than 30-1. You used a pincer formation through the eastern canyon, a good strategy. It nearly worked. Draven's silver skin had gone pale. "But you did not account for the lava tubes beneath the ridge," Idris continued. "My soldiers used them to move behind your lines. We held that position for 19 days. I will not pretend it was clean or glorious. Good people died on both sides. I carry that weight, General, every day." He paused. "As for how it feels to sit here, it feels like the first step toward making sure battles like Kessara 7 never happen again. I did not come here to insult you. I came here to end the war." Draven said nothing. He stared at Idris for a long moment, then looked away and did not speak for the rest of the meal. After dinner, Silara dismissed her court but asked her psychic advisors to remain. There were 3 of them, ancient Valorians with pale, clouded eyes and minds that could reach into the thoughts of others like hands reaching into water. "Read him," Silara commanded quietly. The 3 advisors closed their eyes and reached out with their minds toward Idris, who stood near the observation window, looking at the stars. What happened next was something none of them expected. The first advisor gasped and pulled back as if she had been burned. The second pressed his hands against his temples, his face twisted in confusion. The third simply opened her eyes and stared at Idris with an expression close to fear. "Well," Silara demanded. The eldest advisor spoke carefully. "His mind is not shielded, my queen. It is open, but it is like stepping into an ocean. The depth is beyond anything I have encountered. His memories are layered so densely, so many battles, so many faces, so much pain and survival that we cannot navigate through them. It is like trying to read a library while it is on fire." "Is he dangerous?" The advisor hesitated. "He is the most dangerous man I have ever touched, not because of hatred, because of endurance. His mind has been broken and rebuilt so many times that it has become something entirely new. He does not think like a soldier. He thinks like a survivor who has chosen to keep hopping." Silara dismissed them with a wave of her hand. She stood alone in the empty hall for a long time, staring at the place where Idris had sat. Then she summoned Keyleth. "I need the truth," she told her spy master. "Not the public record, not the classified file, the real truth. Who is this man? What has he done? I need to know everything, even if it means stealing it from the Terran military archives." Keyleth bowed. "It will take time, my queen." "You have until morning." Keyleth vanished into the shadows. Silara walked to the observation window. The stars stared back at her, cold and ancient. She pressed her fingers against the glass and felt the vast emptiness beyond it. In all her centuries, she had never met anyone like this human. He was not stronger than her warriors. He was not smarter than her diplomats. He was not more powerful than her psychics. But there was something about him that she could not name, something solid and unbreakable at his center, like a stone at the bottom of a river that the water could never wash away. It frightened her. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she would never admit existed, it fascinated her. Far below, in the guest quarters assigned to him, Idris Wren sat on the edge of his bed. He opened his leather bag and pulled out a small, worn journal. He turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line. "Day 1. She is exactly as strong as I expected. This might actually work." He closed the journal, turned off the light, and slept without dreaming. It was the first peaceful sleep he had known in years. Keyleth returned before dawn. Silara had not slept. She sat in her private quarters aboard the royal cruiser, wrapped in a dark robe, staring at the stars through the wide observation window. A cup of cold tea sat untouched on the table beside her. Her mind had been turning all night, circling around the same question like a ship caught in a gravity well. Who was Idris Ren? The door chimed softly. She opened it with a thought and her spymaster stepped inside. He looked tired. His silver skin was dull and his normally sharp eyes were troubled. In his hand he carried a data chip, black, unmarked, and no larger than a fingernail. "You found something," Selara said. It was not a question. "I found everything," Keyleth replied. He placed the chip on the table. "It cost me 3 agents, 2 favors I can never call back, and a bribe large enough to buy a warship. The Terrans buried this file deep, my queen, deeper than anything I have ever seen them hide. Why would they hide the record of a man they are offering as a husband?" Keyleth looked at her with an expression she had rarely seen on his face. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was respect not for her, but for the man in the file. "Because if their enemies knew what he truly was," Keyleth said quietly, "they would never have let him live long enough to reach this station." Selara activated the chip. The holographic display filled her quarters with light. Pages of text, battle maps, medical records, and images cascaded through the air around her. It was dense, detailed, and it began with a boy. Idris Ren was born on a Terran frontier colony called Meridian's Edge. It was a farming world, quiet, green, and far from anything important. He was the second of 3 children. His father was an engineer. His mother was a teacher. There was a photograph of them, a family standing in front of a small white house, smiling under a blue sky. Meridian's Edge was one of the first human colonies hit when the war began. The Valorian Third Fleet arrived without warning. The attack lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the colony was ash. 90,000 people lived on Meridian's Edge. Fewer than 200 survived. Idris was 14 years old. He survived by hiding beneath the bodies of his family in the basement of their destroyed home. He lay there for 2 days, covered in dust and blood that was not his own, listening to Valorian soldiers walking above him. He did not move. He did not cry. He simply waited. When the Terran rescue ships finally arrived, they found him sitting outside the ruins, staring at the sky with dry eyes. The medics said he was in shock. They were wrong. He was making a decision. Selara paused the display. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She had ordered the assault on Meridian's Edge. She remembered the report, a minor colony, strategically unimportant, destroyed as a demonstration of Valorian power in the opening weeks of the war. She had not thought about it since. She opened her eyes and continued reading. Idris enlisted in the Terran military at 16 using forged identity documents that listed his age as 18. No one questioned it. The Terrans were desperate for soldiers. He was assigned to a ground infantry unit and sent to the front lines within 3 months. He should have died a dozen times in his first year. He did not. Instead, he survived every engagement, learned every lesson, and rose through the ranks with a speed that alarmed his superiors. By 18, he had earned a battlefield commission as a lieutenant. By 20, he commanded his own company. By 22, he became the youngest captain in the history of the Terran Navy. The file listed his engagements. Selara read each one, and with every entry, the weight in her chest grew heavier. The Siege of Kasara 7. She already knew about this. Draven's humiliation at dinner had made that clear, but the details were far worse than she had imagined. Idris had held a garrison of 300 Terran soldiers against 10,000 Valorian troops for 19 days. They had no reinforcements, limited food, broken communications. Idris had used the volcanic terrain itself as a weapon, collapsing lava tubes, redirecting gas vents, turning the planet against the invaders. When rescue finally arrived, 112 of his soldiers were still alive. Idris was the last one standing at the perimeter, armed with a weapon he had taken from a fallen Valorian officer. The phantom run of the Athari corridor. A single Terran corvette, his corvette, the Long Walk, against an entire Valorian battle fleet. Idris had broadcast false signals, mimicked the energy signatures of a carrier group, and lured the fleet into an asteroid field seeded with mines. The resulting chain of explosions destroyed 9 Valorian warships and crippled 14 more. It was the single most devastating ambush in the entire war, and it was done by one man in one small ship. The liberation of Dulvan Station. This entry made Selara stop breathing for a moment. Dulvan Station was a Valorian military facility where 12,000 human prisoners were held as forced laborers. The conditions were brutal. Hundreds had died from exhaustion, starvation, and abuse. Idris had walked into the station alone and unarmed. He had requested a meeting with the Valorian camp commander, a colonel named Vaith. The meeting lasted 4 hours. No one knew exactly what was said. But when it was over, Colonel Vaith ordered the release of all 12,000 prisoners, surrendered the station, and submitted himself for arrest by his own government. Years later, when Vaith was asked why he had surrendered, he said only one thing: "The human made me see what we had become. I could not look at it any longer." Selara's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table and forced herself to keep reading. The medical section of the file was a horror story written in clinical language. Idris had been shot 7 times, stabbed 3 times. He had survived explosive decompression when his ship was breached during the Battle of the Hollow Moons. He had been exposed to toxic atmosphere on Venger 4 and spent 2 weeks in a medical coma. He had been declared clinically dead twice, once on the operating table after Cassara 7, and once in the wreckage of a crashed transport on the ice world of Felheim. Both times his heart had started again. The Terran soldiers had a name for him. They called him the Revenant, the man who came back from the dead. They told stories about him in barracks and mess halls across the galaxy. To them, he was not just a captain. He was proof that humanity could not be broken. And in the classified files of Valorian military intelligence, he had a different name. Selara found it in a report from her own war ministry, flagged with the highest threat level. They called him the Unbreakable. But it was the final section of the dossier that changed everything. It was a collection of letters, dozens of them written by Idris over the course of the entire war, addressed to the Terran High Council. They were not battle reports or strategic recommendations. They were pleas. In letter, after every battle and every victory, Idris argued for peace. He wrote about the Valorians not as monsters but as people. He described their culture, their art, their music. He wrote about a Valorian medic he had captured who had spent her final hours tending to wounded Terran soldiers. He wrote about the beauty of a Valorian sunset he had witnessed on a contested world, standing in the ruins of a city he had helped destroy. He wrote that the war was wrong, not because humanity was losing, they were not losing, but because both sides were becoming something worse with every year it continued. And he had learned High Valorian not as a tool of espionage, but as an act of faith. He believed that one day, humans and Valorians would need to speak to each other. He wanted to be ready. The last letter in the collection was dated just 3 weeks before the peace summit. It was short. "I have spent 11 years fighting a war I never wanted. I have killed people who did not deserve to die and buried friends who deserved to live. If there is a chance to end this, any chance at all, no matter the cost to me, I will take it. Send me." Selara closed the file. The holographic display vanished and her quarters fell into soft darkness. She sat very still for a long time. She had expected a pawn, a political tool, a simple soldier dressed up in a suit and sent to play a role he did not understand. Instead, the Terrans had sent her the man who had bled more for this war than anyone on either side. A man who had earned the right to hate her people, who had every reason to want revenge. and had instead spent 11 years fighting for the possibility of peace. They had sent her their best, not their strongest general or their richest politician, their best human being. Selara stood and walked to the observation deck. The corridors of the royal cruiser were empty at this hour. Her footsteps echoed on the polished floor. She found Idris already there. He stood at the wide window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the stars. He was wearing a simple gray shirt and dark trousers. Without his uniform, he looked smaller, more human. There were scars on his forearms, thin white lines that caught the starlight. He turned when he heard her approach. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Your Majesty," he said, "trouble sleeping." "I do not require much sleep," she replied. It was true, but it was also an excuse. She studied his face in the dim light. Now that she knew what lay behind those calm eyes, she saw it differently. The calmness was not emptiness. It was control, the kind of control that came from carrying an unbearable weight and choosing, every single day, not to put it down. "Captain Wren," she said, "why did you agree to this?" He looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the stars. "Because I have seen what this war does, to your people and to mine. I have stood in the ashes of places that used to be someone's home and wondered if any of it was worth it." He paused. It was not. Selara stepped closer. She stood beside him at the window, her reflection a silver ghost in the glass next to his darker one. "You have every reason to hate us," she said quietly. "Meridian's edge." Something flickered across his face, a shadow quickly hidden. "I did hate you for a long time, but hatred is heavy, Your Majesty, and I had too far to walk to carry it." He turned to look at her. His eyes were steady and warm, like coals that had burned through their fire and now gave only heat. "It is a beautiful galaxy," he said, "worth fighting for, worth stopping for too." Selara said nothing. She stood beside this strange, scarred, unbreakable human and looked out at the stars. For the first time in 11 years, the silence between enemies felt like something else entirely. It felt like the beginning of something. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. The stars burned on, ancient and patient, and the galaxy waited to see what would happen next. The days that followed were unlike anything Atheron's cradle had ever seen. A Valorian queen and a human captain, walking together through the corridors of a neutral station, while two civilizations held their breath. Diplomats from both sides scrambled to finalize treaty language. Journalists from 100 worlds crowded the station's press wing, hungry for any scrap of information. And behind closed doors on both sides of the war, powerful people were very, very angry. War Prince Thalik received the news aboard his flagship, the Sorrow of Stars, which orbited a Valorian military outpost 3 systems away. Thalik was everything Idris was not: tall, broad, draped in medals and ancestral honors. He was of royal blood, a distant cousin to Selara herself, and he had spent 2 centuries climbing the ranks of the Valorian military with one ambition burning in his chest: to sit beside the queen as her consort and rule the empire through her. Now a human was about to take that place. Thalik crushed the data tablet in his silver fist and let the pieces fall to the floor. "This is treason," he said to the officers gathered around him. "The queen has lost her mind. She would pollute the eternal throne with alien blood, with human blood, rather than finish the war we were born to win." His officers said nothing. They knew better than to speak when Thalik was in this mood. "The wedding cannot happen," Thalik said. "If the queen will not protect the dignity of our people, then I will protect it for her." He sent a coded message to 6 of his most loyal soldiers, assassins trained in the old ways, skilled with energy blades and silent movement. Their orders were simple: kill the human before the ceremony. Make it look like an accident if possible. If not, make it look like the humans did it themselves. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, a different kind of poison was spreading. On the Terran side, A group of senators and military leaders who called themselves the Victory Coalition had spent weeks trying to stop the marriage. They did not want peace. The war had made them powerful. Defense contracts, military promotions, political influence, all of it depended on the fighting continuing. A peace treaty would end their careers. They could not touch Idris physically. He was too well guarded, and killing him would make him a martyr. So they chose a different weapon. They leaked stories to the Terran press, fabricated interviews, doctored communications. Within days, headlines screamed across human space. Captain Wren, hero or traitor? Sources say Wren volunteered to surrender humanity's sovereignty. Marriage to alien queen, peace deal or sellout. The propaganda was crude but effective. On Terran colony worlds, protests erupted. Soldiers who had fought beside Idris watched the news in confusion and anger. The man they had followed into hell was being called a coward by people who had never held a weapon. Idris saw the reports. He read every headline, every lie, every twisted quote attributed to unnamed sources. He sat alone in his quarters and absorbed it all with the same calm patience he brought to everything. Then he closed the news feed and went to meet Selara for their morning walk. She noticed the change in him immediately. Not in his face, his expression was as steady as ever, but in his shoulders. They carried a fraction more weight than the day before. "You have seen the Terran broadcasts," she said. "I have." "Does it trouble you?" Idris was quiet for a moment. They walked along the observation promenade, where the wide windows showed the slow rotation of distant stars. "It troubles me that people are afraid," he said. "Fear makes people believe terrible things. My people are afraid that this marriage means surrender. Your people are afraid that it means weakness. Both sides are wrong, but fear does not care about being wrong." Selara studied him. Over the past several days, she had spent more time with this human than she had spent with any single person in decades. She had watched him tend a small collection of potted plants aboard his ship, flowers and grasses from every world he had fought on, including 3 Valorian species that he had somehow kept alive in Terran soil. She had seen him sit in the station's library for hours, reading Valorian poetry with the same focus he probably brought to battle plans. And she had seen his journal. Not its contents, he kept it private, but she had noticed how he opened it each night and wrote carefully before sleeping. She had asked him what he wrote. "Names," he had said. "Every soldier I have lost, I write their names so I do not forget them. If I forget them, then their deaths meant nothing." She had not known what to say to that. In 300 years of rule, no one had ever made her speechless. Now, walking beside him, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She was not sure what to call it. It was not love, not yet. It was something quieter, a recognition, a sense that she was standing next to someone who was, in some deep and fundamental way, her equal, not in power or age or strength, in substance. "Idris," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked at her. "I want you to know that I have made my decision. Not because of the treaty, not because of politics. I have read your file. I have watched you these past days, and I believe you are worthy of standing beside me." Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth that he usually kept hidden. "Thank you, Selara." It was the first time he had used her name without her title. She did not correct him. The ceremony was scheduled for the following evening. A grand procession was planned through the main concourse of Atheron's cradle, a symbolic walk representing the 2 civilizations coming together. Selara would walk from the Valorian side. Idris would walk from the Terran side. They would meet in the middle. It was beautiful in theory. Thalic's assassins arrived at the station, hidden among a group of Valorian cultural performers who had been invited to the ceremony. They carried their energy blades disguised as musical instruments. They had studied the procession route. They knew exactly where the security gaps were. The procession began at sunset, or what passed for sunset on a space station. The lights along the main concourse dimmed to a warm gold. Music played from speakers hidden in the walls, a blend of Terran strings and Valorian crystal harmonics. Selara walked from the east, flanked by her honor guard. She wore black and gold, and her crown of floating crystals blazed above her head. She moved with the grace of centuries. Idris walked from the west alone. He had refused an escort. He wore his dress uniform, cleaned and pressed, with one addition, a small pin on his collar in the shape of a Valorian starflower. It was a symbol of respect for the fallen. Selara had not asked him to wear it. He had chosen it himself. They were 50 meters apart when it happened. The 6 assassins moved like shadows. They burst from the crowd on the Valorian side, their disguises falling away, their energy blades igniting with a sharp hiss of white light. They were fast, faster than any human could match. They had trained for this their entire lives. They headed straight for Idris. The crowd screamed. The honor guard surged forward, but they were too far away. The assassins had timed it perfectly, a gap in coverage, a blind spot in the security net, a handful of seconds where Idris stood alone and exposed. 5 seconds. That was all Thalic's assassins needed. They did not get 5 seconds. Idris moved the instant the first blade ignited. He did not freeze. He did not flinch. 11 years of war had written themselves into his muscles, his nerves, his bones. His body knew what to do before his mind had finished processing what was happening. The first assassin reached him with a downward slash. Idris sidestepped, caught the attacker's wrist and twisted. The blade fell. Idris drove his elbow into the assassin's throat and sent him crashing to the ground. The second and third came together. Idris grabbed the fallen blade and met them head-on. He was shorter, slower, and weaker than both of them. It did not matter. He fought like water flowing around their strikes, redirecting their force, using their own momentum against them. He disarmed one with a sharp strike to the wrist and dropped the other with a sweeping kick that no Valorian fighting style had ever seen. The fourth assassin's blade found its mark. It cut across Idris's ribs, opening a long wound that immediately bled through his uniform. Idris staggered but did not fall. He grabbed the assassin's arm, pulled him close, and headbutted him so hard that the Valorian's nose shattered. The fifth assassin circled behind him, aiming for his spine. Idris spun, took the blade on his forearm, a deep cut that would have made most people scream, and drove the stolen energy blade through the assassin's shoulder. The sixth and final assassin did not aim for Idris. He aimed for Selara. Idris saw it happening. The assassin was fast, already past the staggering honor guard, his blade raised and aimed at the queen's heart. There was no time to fight, no time to think. Idris threw himself between them. The blade punched through his side just below his ribs. White-hot pain exploded through his body. He felt the energy searing his flesh, burning from the inside. But his hands found the assassin's throat and he squeezed with everything he had left. The assassin dropped. Idris pulled the blade from his own body, let it fall, and collapsed to his knees. The honor guard finally reached them. The surviving assassins were seized. The crowd was in chaos. Medics rushed forward, their hands already glowing with healing light. Selara stood frozen. She stared at the man kneeling before her, bleeding from half a dozen wounds, his uniform soaked in red. He had placed his body between her and death without a moment of hesitation. Idris looked up at her. His face was pale and his breath came in short, ragged gasps, but his eyes were still calm, still warm, and impossibly, unbelievably, he smiled. "Guess they do not want us getting along," he said. Then he fell forward, and Selara caught him. She did not think about it. She did not consider protocol or dignity or the hundreds of cameras pointed at her. She dropped to her knees, cradled his head against her chest, and shouted for medics with a voice that shook the walls. Her silver hands were stained red with human blood. The galaxy watched. Within the hour, Selara stood before a broadcast array that transmitted her image to every corner of Valorian space. Her armor was still marked with Idris's blood. She had not changed. She wanted her people to see it. "Citizens of the Queendom," she said. Her voice was iron. "Tonight, War Prince Thalik sent assassins to murder the man I have chosen as my partner in peace. This act of cowardice and treason will not stand. Thalik is hereby stripped of all rank, title, and honor. He is an enemy of the throne." She paused. Her golden eyes burned directly into the camera. "I have ruled you for 300 years. I have led you in conquest and in glory. I have never flinched from war. But this man, this human, has shown me something I had forgotten. Strength is not only the power to destroy. It is the courage to stop destroying. It is the will to reach out your hand to an enemy and say, 'Enough.'" Her voice softened, not with weakness but with something deeper. "The wedding will proceed, not because of a treaty, not because of politics, because I choose it, because he is worthy, and because it is time." The broadcast ended. Across Valorian space, billions sat in silence. Deep in the medical bay of Atheron's cradle, Idris Ren floated in a healing tank, his wounds slowly closing under the blue light of Valorian medical technology. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind wandering through old memories and new ones. When he finally woke fully and clearly, the first thing he saw was Selara sitting beside his bed. She had not moved. Her crown was gone. Her armor was set aside. She sat in a simple chair in a simple robe, and she looked at him with eyes that held something she had not shown anyone in centuries. "You almost died," she said. "I have practice," he replied. She reached out and took his hand. Her silver fingers wrapped around his scarred, human ones. "The wedding will proceed," she said quietly. "Not because of the treaty, because I choose it." Idris looked at her hand holding his. He closed his fingers around hers and held on. "Then I choose it too," he said. Outside the medical bay, the stars burned on, and for the first time in 11 years, they looked a little brighter. The wedding was held aboard the Valorian throne ship Eternal Dawn, the largest vessel ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. It was not just a ship, it was a city that sailed through the stars. Its halls were carved from living crystal that sang when light passed through it. Its gardens held flowers from every world the Valorians had ever touched. Its central chamber, the Hall of Eternity, had hosted the coronation of every Valorian queen for the last 4,000 years. Today, it would host something the galaxy had never seen before. The preparations had taken 3 days. 3 days of arguments over protocol, seating arrangements, music, and 1,000 other details that threatened to unravel the fragile peace before it even began. Valorian tradition demanded one thing. Terran tradition demanded another. In the end, both sides compromised, which meant both sides were equally unhappy, which meant it was probably fair. Billions watched the broadcast. Every major network in the galaxy carried it live. On Terran colony worlds, people gathered in town squares and watched on massive public screens. On Valorian stations and planets, families sat together in their homes, their golden eyes fixed on holographic displays. On neutral worlds, in alien bars and trading posts and embassy lounges, species that had nothing to do with the war stopped what they were doing and watched. Everyone understood what this moment meant. It was not just a wedding. It was the end of something terrible and the beginning of something unknown. The Hall of Eternity was filled to capacity. On the left side sat the Valorian delegation, generals, diplomats, nobles, and representatives from every colony in the Queendom. Their silver skin caught the light of the crystal walls, and they sat in rigid formal silence. On the right side sat the Terran delegation, senators, admirals, ambassadors, and a carefully chosen group of soldiers who had served with Idris during the war. They were less formal. Some of them were crying before the ceremony even started. At the front of the hall stood the altar, a simple arch of white stone, ancient beyond measure, inscribed with words in Old Valorian that translated roughly to, "What is joined here, the stars cannot separate." Ambassador Lena Marsh sat in the front row of the Terran delegation. She folded her hands in her lap and let out a long breath. She had worked toward this day for 3 years. Secret negotiations, back-channel diplomacy, sleepless nights spent arguing with politicians who could not see past their own ambition. She had personally chosen Idris for this role, not because he was the strongest or the most famous, but because he was the only person she had ever met who could carry the weight of 2 civilizations on his shoulders and still stand up straight. She hoped she had chosen correctly. The music began. It was a piece composed specifically for the occasion, Valorian crystal harmonics woven together with Terran strings and piano. The melody was slow and beautiful, rising and falling like breath, like waves, like the space between heartbeats. It filled the hall of eternity and made the crystal walls glow softly in response. Idris entered from the right. He walked slowly, not because of ceremony, but because his wounds still ached. The Valorian medical technology had healed the worst of the damage, but the blade that had punched through his side had left a mark that would take weeks to fully close. He felt it with every step, a dull, pulling pain that reminded him of what he had chosen and what it had cost. He wore a uniform that belonged to neither side alone. The Terran tailors had crafted it in deep blue, the color of Earth's oceans. The Valorian weavers had threaded it with silver fine lines that caught the light and shimmered like starlight on water. On his left breast, he wore a Terran service pin. On his right collar, he wore the Valorian starflower he had chosen himself days ago, now made in silver and crystal by Selara's own jewelers. He carried no weapons. He carried no medals. He carried only himself, scarred, tired, unbreakable, and walking forward. The Terran soldiers in the audience watched him and felt their throats tighten. They had followed this man into darkness. They had watched him bleed. They had seen him carry the dying and bury the dead and still wake up the next morning ready to fight. And now he was walking toward something none of them had believed possible. Selara entered from the left. She did not wear a wedding gown. She wore ceremonial armor black as the void between stars, trimmed with gold that moved like living flame. It was the traditional garb of a Valorian queen entering a new alliance. It was not a symbol of romance. It was a symbol of power freely shared. By wearing it, she declared to her people that this union was not submission, it was partnership. Her crown of floating crystal shards orbited her head, and each shard rang with a faint, high note as she moved. Her golden eyes were fixed straight ahead, and she walked with the grace of a woman who had led an empire for 3 centuries. She looked magnificent, and for the first time in all those centuries, she looked hopeful. They met at the altar. Idris looked up at her. She was taller than him by nearly a head. Her silver skin glowed in the soft light, and her eyes held a depth that could swallow stars. He was a small, scarred human standing before a queen who could trace her bloodline back 10,000 years. He smiled at her. It was a quiet, real, warm smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. She smiled back. It surprised her own court more than anything else that had happened in the past week. The ceremony was conducted by the eldest of Selara's psychic advisors, the same woman who had tried to read Idris's mind days ago and had nearly drowned in its depth. Her voice was thin and ancient, but it carried through the vast hall like wind through an open window. The vows were spoken in both languages. Selara spoke hers first, in High Valorian. Her words were precise and powerful, carrying the weight of tradition that stretched back millennia. She spoke of duty, of honor, of the courage required to build something new from the ruins of something broken. Then Idris spoke his vows, in High Valorian. His accent was rougher than hers. His voice did not carry the same ancient resonance, but every word was correct. Every phrase was chosen with care. He spoke of respect for her people, for their history, for the lives lost on both sides. He spoke of the future, not as something guaranteed, but as something worth building together, stone by stone, day by day. When he finished, the Valorian court was weeping, not with sorrow, not with joy exactly, with something harder to name, the overwhelming, aching realization that an enemy had loved their culture enough to learn its most sacred language, and had spoken his most important words in their tongue rather than his own. The binding ritual began. In Valorian tradition, a marriage between rulers was sealed not with rings or signatures, but with a psychic bond, a joining of minds witnessed by the collective consciousness of the Valorian people. The psychic network was a shared empathic web that connected all Valorians, a faint and constant hum of shared feeling that ran through their species like a river through stone. Selara was the anchor of that network. As queen, she sat at its center. When she opened herself to the bond, every Valorian in the galaxy would feel it. She reached out and took Idris's hands, his scarred fingers wrapped around her silver ones. The psychic advisor placed her own hands over theirs and closed her eyes. And the bond opened. What happened next was not planned, it was not expected, and it changed everything. When Selara opened herself to the bond, she opened herself to Idris. And because she was the anchor of her people's psychic network, what she felt, they all felt. Every Valorian in the galaxy, billions of souls spread across 9 star systems, suddenly felt what it was like to be Idris Ren. They felt a boy lying under the bodies of his family, breathing dust, choosing to survive. They felt a young soldier charging into fire for the first time, terrified and determined in equal measure. They felt the exhaustion of 19 days on Kesara 7, the hunger, the thirst, the unshakable refusal to give up. They felt the loneliness of a man sitting in a small ship, learning a foreign language word by word, night after night, because he believed that one day it would matter. They felt the grief, the endless, crushing grief of carrying the names of every person he had lost, writing them down each night so they would not be forgotten. And beneath all of it, beneath the pain and the scars and the weariness, they felt something that burned so brightly it hurt. Hope. Not naive hope, not blind optimism. The stubborn, tested, unbreakable hope of a man who had seen the absolute worst that the universe could do to a person and had still chosen to believe that things could be better, that people could be better, that the galaxy was worth saving. They felt what it meant to be human. Across Valorian space, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans of the war dropped to their knees. Mothers held their children and wept. Soldiers on border stations lowered their weapons and stared at nothing, tears running down their silver cheeks. On a dozen worlds in 1,000 cities, the same stunned silence fell, the silence of an entire civilization having its understanding of the universe rewritten in a single moment. On the Terran side, the soldiers who had served with Idris watched the Valorians weep and understood, somehow, what had happened. One of them, a sergeant named Cole who had fought beside Idris at Kesara 7, wiped his eyes and whispered to no one in particular, "That's our captain." The bond settled, the ceremony was complete. Selara and Idris stood together at the altar, hands still joined, and faced the hall. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of what had just happened filled the room like light fills a dark space, completely and without resistance. Later, when the ceremony was over and the guests had departed and the broadcast had ended, Selara and Idris stood together on the observation deck of the Eternal Dawn. The stars spread out before them, infinite and ancient, and the silence between them was warm. "My people will write songs about this day," Selara said, "about the human who ended the war." Idris shook his head. "I did not end anything. We did, both sides. Every soldier who was tired of fighting, every mother who wanted her children home. I am just the fool who said yes to a wedding." Selara looked at him. Her golden eyes were softer than he had ever seen them. "History will remember you as a living legend," she said. Idris took her hand. His rough, scarred fingers laced through her smooth, silver ones. He looked out at the stars, the same stars he had fought under, bled under, and nearly died under more times than he could count. "I would rather just be remembered as someone who tried," he said. Selara leaned into him. The queen of 9 star systems, 300 years old and powerful beyond measure, rested her head against the shoulder of a small, scarred human who had walked through fire and come out the other side still reaching for peace. And across the galaxy, in barracks and homes, on stations and ships, humans and Valorians alike raised a glass. Not to a king, not to a conqueror, but to the stubborn, unbreakable, impossibly hopeful nature of a species that the universe had tried its very best to destroy and failed. Because that was the truth the stars had learned the hard way. You could wound a human, break a human, burn everything they loved to ash and leave them with nothing but dust and silence. And they would still reach out their hand and offer you peace. That was what made them legends.